Welcome back. In this video, we'll get an overview of what we would be learning in the next few steps. In the next few steps, we would want to create a simple SOAP web service using Spring Web Services. Spring Web Services promotes a contract-first approach to creating web services. It means you would actually define the format of the request and the response before you would start with developing your web service. So that's the first thing we would start with. We would start with defining our service. We would define XMLs for our request and response, and we would define XSDs for them. XSD stands for XML Schema Definition. So what we want to create is a web service provider, right? We would want to create a SOAP web service provider, which can accept a SOAP in XML request and provide an output in the terms of a SOAP XML response. Let's look at an example of the request. This is at a high level the kind of request that we would want to be able to process. You have an envelope with a header and a body. Header is optional in requests. Inside the body, we have the actual content of the request. We would want to get the details of a specific course. So we would actually build a course management service. We would want to get the details for a specific course. The ID of the course is an input to the course. So the input to the web service is this request. And the output from the web service would be a response. We would want to give a response back, get course details response with the course details. The details which we will provide are ID, name, and description. If you look at the request and the response, the high-level structure remains the same: envelope, header, and a body. However, the details of the request are different from the details of the response. What we'll start with is defining the exact structure of how we would want the request to look like. And we'll also define the structure of how we would want our response to look like. Once we have a clear idea about how our request and the response should look like, we would define an XSD. XML Schema Definition defines how your request and response should look like. What kind of structure should they have? What are the valid values for each of the elements inside the request? So we would do all that stuff while we would define an XML Schema Definition. So we would first define our services. We would actually generate the WSDL. We would not really create it by hand. What we would do is we would configure Spring Web Services Framework to generate the WSDL for us. One another thing which we would configure is something called JAX-B Maven plugin. JAX-B stands for Java API for XML binding. The input is an XML request, a SOAP XML request. Inside the web service provider, we are creating a Java application. So we are talking about objects. So how does the XML which comes in get converted to an object? And how does the object get converted to the response? That's where XML binding comes into picture. JAX-B is a standard for Java API for XML binding. What we'll do is we'll configure a Maven plugin called JAX-B Maven plugin. We will define the XSDs. So this JAX-B Maven plugin will take the XSDs and generate Java objects. The endpoints are the things which would process the request. They would have all the business logic related to a request and they would create the response back. So in the endpoint, what we would do is we would use the JAX-B Java objects to get the values from the request and also to populate the values into the response. As part of this framework configuration, that is basically the Spring Web Services configuration, we will also configure generating a WSDL. We would need a web service client so that we can execute the request and get the response back. We will use a Chrome plugin called Whistler. Whistler also have support for Firefox. It's quite a simple plugin and it's more than sufficient for what we would be doing in this specific course. I'm excited to help you create your first SOAP web service. We will take this in small steps and I'm sure you will have a lot of fun and you will learn a lot during the next few steps where you are going to create your first SOAP web service. I'll see you in the next step.